record to the cloud.
There you go.
Huzzah.
Yay, all right, I think.
Great. So let me double check my invites. I think that there may be one more person that we're waiting for, but
Oh, no. We're down there. There we go. Oh,
so
let me go back.
Susan, have you and I been on a committee together before?
I think so.
You look really familiar.
Were you on the 2040?
With the housing needs analysis and the economic
Mhm.
opportunities analysis. Yep.
Yeah, I was there.
Okay. That is what I thought.
All right, I'll be right back. I'll print out this agenda.
Robert, I'm going to set it up on the screen in a few moments.
Oh, I've got it printing out too.
Okay.
I tried reading through all the other stuff, but 42 pages of printing.
A lot.
Oh, too expensive. Oh.
So Erin, how about we start introductions? Is that okay?
that sounds great to me.
Do you want to start them out?
Sure. My name is Erin Engman. I'm the senior planner at the city of Tualatin, and I've been the one that's been corresponding with you. I'm excited to introduce this project, and both Corinne and Beth will tell you more about it. But first, I'll hand it over to Steve to introduce himself on the city side.
Hey everyone, I'm Steve Cooper. I'm the Assistant Community Development Director. Erin is serving as the project manager on the city side for this project, but I'm joining her here. I've worked on some of the city's previous housing efforts, so I'm here to provide some continuity. And in that regard, I just want to say thanks to all of the volunteers. This is really great to be able to continue this work, and I'm really thrilled to be a part of it. So again, thank you for participating, and I'll turn it over to Beth and Corinne to make introductions.
Okay, well, I'll start the introductions. I'm Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest. I've been engaged with the city of Tualatin since about 2019, it might have been 2018, on issues related to housing as well as economic development. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes. I'm the project director on this project, which means that I'm really asking Corinne and Mary to do a lot of the project work. So Corinne, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Corinne Sacedo, working with Beth and the team here to push this HIP, the housing plan, forward. Really interested in hearing you guys' feedback today. And yeah, Mary, maybe you can introduce yourself. You've been doing a lot of legwork on this.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Mary. I'm an associate with Echo Northwest, and I've been helping with a lot of the analysis that we're going to talk about later. I'm just excited to hear feedback.
Shall we start off with Susan?
I am Susan Nowak. I think I'm wearing two hats for this committee. I'm currently board chair for the Tualatin Chamber of Commerce, and I also chair the Tualatin Aging Task Force, which is a senior advocacy committee.
How about Rachel?
taking notes. Hi, Rachel Duke, Executive Director at Community Partners for Affordable Housing. We're a community housing development organization, and we're working in Tualatin right now. We're getting ready to apply to actually apply for the permit. So we're almost halfway there to achieving a 116 unit apartment building in the Basalt Creek area called Plambek Gardens. Pretty exciting.
Excellent. Hey, Robert, will you introduce yourself? You're muted, I'm sorry.
And that must have been me for sure. Robert Dalton, poor person. But I've been here in Tualatin almost 2 years come October. I lived here before. I was born and raised here in Washington County, and then moved away back in 1989 and moved back now just 2 years ago. Lived in California, Washington, Indiana, Texas, Kentucky. Kentucky lasted for about 15 years. And then we moved back, like I said, this October would be 2 years ago. So it's nice being back. And just interested in this because I've got a great interest, in making sure that funding and everything else for low income, really is for low income. I've seen it where it hasn't been, or what they've considered as low income really isn't.
Okay. And Zach?
Pardon me one moment. I'm having some trouble with my main computers here on my phone for the moment. My name is Zach Weimer. I'm one of the members of the Tualatin Planning Commission. And that is the capacity that I'm here in today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, we're excited to have you all here. We think this will be an interesting set of discussions. So is it okay, Erin, if I take it away?
That sounds great. Thanks, Beth. Let me know if you have any trouble sharing your screen.
Well, that's what I was going to try next.
Okay.
It lets me do it. So here, I'm just going to put up the agenda for today's meeting. And this is really a get to know you meeting and get to know some of what we've done in the past and some of what we're trying to accomplish in this project. We'll talk about 2 of the different strategies from the housing production strategy, and we'll give you some information about that. So the intention with the first couple of meetings is to bring information about each of the housing production strategy actions that we're talking about, so that we have a common base of understanding, and then start to talk about how they fit together and don't fit together in terms of funding. So these first few meetings will be a getting up to speed. I like to, when I present, and Corinne agreed with me when he presents, I like to have people ask questions as we go along. So if you're not sure of something, just speak up. So this project builds on 2 other projects that we've been doing over the years for Tualatin. So the first one is the Tualatin Housing Needs Assessment that was completed in December 2019. It looks at housing needs for Tualatin over the 2020 to 2040 period. It was part of the Tualatin 2040 plan. There's a lot of interesting information in here, but as we talk about housing need, which we will be talking about in a few minutes, this is what we're really building on. And then the other thing we're building on is the housing production strategy, which was finished last summer. So the housing production strategy includes, I'm going to scroll down until I find the right table. It includes many different strategies, some of which we're talking about in this project, and some of which we aren't talking about. And so, Susan, you were talking about being with the Tualatin Seniors Group. So one of the things you might be looking for is what is Tualatin thinking about doing around seniors? So let me see, there's somewhere in here, there is a strategy that is specific to accessible housing. And then I forget exactly where that strategy is sitting in here. That's not one of the strategies we're talking about here, because that's not a strategy that requires a lot of money, and it's not a funding strategy. So it's not a revenue generating strategy. And this project is all about looking at these strategies that are going to require money and going to potentially bring money in, and look at the mismatch between them and think about what it is that the city does. So realize that there's many other strategies that are not included in what we're talking about here. So if you're missing something, one of the places to look is to see if we have it in the housing production strategy. Stephen and Aaron, are these documents available on the website, and can we provide people with links to those two documents? Maybe you already have.
I haven't shared the links yet, but I am certainly happy to do so after this meeting concludes. So I'll make those available to the group.
Okay, great. And so Robert, you were talking about many, many pages to read. Those two documents are, you know, really long documents in and of themselves. So there's a lot of background that we're building on from here. And so if you have questions, and I think those questions can be answered in those documents, I'll try to direct you to the right parts of those documents. With that, does anybody have any questions before we go into a little background about what some of those projects found and what we're trying to do here?
Are we working off of the 2019 numbers for the medium income levels for Tualatin?
Let me get to that in a few minutes,
Okay.
because I forget exactly where we are on that, because it's been a few minutes since I looked at that slide.
Yeah, I just looked up at it earlier, and it was like 88,000 was median income on 2019 is what they considered for Tualatin.
Oh, and I will explain all of that.
Okay.
So yeah. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start the PowerPoint. Everybody can see where we are here. So I mentioned that we did a housing needs analysis. A housing needs analysis is an analysis that that is required by the state, and it's about how is the city going to grow over the next 20 years in terms of new housing. And it's trying to answer the question, does Tualatin have enough land to accommodate housing? And it doesn't get at it brings information in, but it doesn't get at do we have enough housing that's affordable for people in Tualatin and, you know, people who want to move here within the region? And if we don't, which no city in Oregon honestly does, what do we do about that? Well, in I think it was 2020, well, it must have been in 2020. The state passed House Bill 2003, which you probably haven't heard of, but it requires, among other things, development of a housing production strategy. And Tualatin was one of the first 3 cities in the state to develop a housing production strategy. And a housing production strategy is essentially, it's an 8-year action plan. What it does is it brings information in about what Tualatin's housing needs are, both by income levels, and then looking at different groups of people. So say seniors or people with disabilities, what their housing needs are and how they're different from the overall average housing needs. We brought in stakeholder engagement from the housing needs analysis, other projects that Tualatin had been working on over the last few years to bring in additional information about housing needs in Tualatin that you don't just see in the data. There's a lot of things that the data is not good enough to tell us. And with that, we identified strategies to meet future need. We evaluated all of those strategies for achieving fair and equitable housing outcomes. And the city, I don't think it was adopted, I think it accepted its housing implementation, housing production strategy. And what that means is that the city is committed to, over the next 6 years, trying to implement the strategic actions in the housing production strategy. So a strategic action might well be develop an equitable housing plan, which one of the actions is that. We're doing that here. So we're getting something done there. There's actions about changes to zoning code. which are, Steve, you could possibly talk about how those are coming out, but those would be processed through the Planning Commission. There's other actions that would be processed through different venues, essentially. Do you have any questions about what a housing production strategy is before I go on? Okay. All right, so I just made this point about the housing needs analysis being a lot about land and the housing production strategy being a lot about affordable housing. So we have a project schedule. We have to be finished with this project because this is funded by a grant from the state. We need to be finished with it by May 2023. So what you can see here is that we've got 4 different meetings set up with this advisory committee, where we'll be talking about different information, bringing different information into this discussion. I suspect meeting number 2 probably is not going to be in mid-August. I suspect it'll actually be bumped out a little bit to October, and the October's meeting will be bumped a little bit to November. But that'll be okay. We'll basically be staying on schedule. We will be finishing the project in May, and you can see that we've got a public workshop that we can put either in October or in November, and we've got a draft plan that's going to be going to the City Council and the Planning Commission. Zach, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. I just wondered, obviously this is a planning process, but what constitutes project finished? At what stage? What are our victory conditions, if you will, that we would consider this a successful process by May?
Well, I think that we've got another slide or two about what we're trying to achieve here. Is that okay if we go into that?
That's perfectly fine. Yes, thank you.
Sure. Okay. So this project is an action in the housing production strategy. The goals of the project are reducing financial and potentially regulatory impediments to developing housing. So a thing to understand about the housing production strategy is it's about housing building. How can the city support building new housing or preserving existing affordable housing? It's not a set of actions about how can the city help individual households. That helping of individual households is really done by other organizations. So for instance, by Rachel's organization, Community Partners for Affordable Housing, in building housing that's affordable. Rachel, honestly, I don't know if you guys provide any services to people. Those kind of services and that kind of thing are provided through nonprofit and other governmental agencies. So this is about building housing, preserving existing housing. So creating financial and regulatory incentives, that's part of what this project is about, and identifying resources available to increase availability and affordability of needed housing. Those are our big goals. So what I would say, and Steve and Aaron, I invite you to pipe in, especially if I get this wrong, is I would say part of the goal of this project is to raise the awareness and understanding of these issues, especially among elected and appointed officials, but among the residents of Tualatin in general, to make it clear that if Tualatin wants to support developing these different types of housing, so these deeply affordable housing types, affordable ownership housing, sort of middle income housing types, and we'll get into what these things mean in a few minutes, then there's going to have to be resources to do that. You can change your zoning code, and that costs you staff time and hearings time. But going beyond things like regulatory changes, at a certain point, you have to have resources to support that housing development. And so we'll be talking about some of those resources here. Does that answer your question, Zach?
Yes, I think it does. Thank you so much.
Did I miss anything, Steve or Aaron? Okay.
I think you covered that great. I don't have anything to add. I might just let everyone know that I may stop my video because it sounds like I have an inconsistent internet connection. So if you see me disappear, that's why.
We understand. All right, so the role of pardon me, I just want to move something on my screen. The role of the advisory committee is about reviewing and providing feedback of information that we bring to you for the project. I think as we start to bring more information together, it will start to become clearer what we're trying to do. For people who have experience accessing affordable housing, or who have clients who have experience accessing affordable housing, sharing that experience, yours or experience of people you know, helping with prioritization of the strategic actions, and making a recommendation at the end of the project to the council to accept by resolution the work of the affordable housing funding plan. Inherent in that is an assumption that we will be incorporating your feedback into what we're hearing, so that we are successfully capturing what you think should be in this plan. And exactly what this plan looks like is something that we need to decide together a little bit. We'll be working with staff on. There's no set look for it, but I'm looking for something that at least the main body of the report is a little shorter and a little easier to access than the other products we've produced. So there may be some specific recommendations about specific actions, but we don't have any requests for those right now. Okay. Going on. All right, going on, maybe if I can get my thing to work. So let's talk specifically about housing needs in Tualatin. So the city is forecast to grow by a little more than 1,000 households, dwelling units, between 2020 and 2040. Tualatin has not much vacant land. A lot of the vacant land is down in Basalt Creek. We found in the project that there was a deficit of about 7 acres of medium high density land and about 4 acres of high density high rise plan designations. So for your medium and your higher density housing types, of which that's a lot of what we're talking about here, you don't have enough land. And so part of what I think the city, what came out in the housing needs analysis and what the city needs to be looking at, and I think we'll naturally be looking at in other projects, is opportunities for redevelopment. And some of the policies that we'll be talking about a little bit later around urban renewal, for instance, those support those types of policies, support redevelopment. Steve, have you guys been talking about how the city maybe through another process looking at the climate-friendly equitable communities rules that are coming out of the state?
We have not developed it into a process that we're looking at this point. We're monitoring and waiting for the final rules, and then I think we'll have some decision making to do on how we approach that.
And so that is something that's going to phase in over several years. It's going to take some time. It's a kind of big, complicated process to implement. But I think that that's going to push opportunities for redevelopment. I was thinking about that a little bit. And since we know where your areas for that would be, where your areas for more dense development would be, because I think they're metro, is it town centers or regional centers?
Yeah, it varies, but in our case, it's I think it's our town center designation. And I would just add that I think that obviously some of the early provisions that would reduce parking are certainly supportive of some of this type of development. And I think we see that parking can be a financial burden on the success of development. And so to that end, I see there's definitely a synergy between this project and that project.
And so this is new, as Steve says, it's not even finalized as rules yet. So to the extent that it is helpful to bring information in from what the city is doing on that, to inform this a little bit. I don't want to get too deep into that work, because that's going to be complicated work that'll take a few years in and of itself. But that is going to play into some of this, I think. So back to Tualatin's housing needs. We found that there's a need for more affordable housing, and we'll talk about what that means in a few moments, but especially for renter households. And there's need for more opportunities for people to live and work in Tualatin. I often joke that the Tualatin 2040 process for the housing needs analysis was almost, what it was lacking was a transportation system plan. People wanted to talk about transportation a great deal. And that's an important part that goes into planning for housing, but it's not housing planning in and of itself. So what came out of the housing needs analysis was really a clear statement that there needed to be less commuting and more opportunity for people to live and work in Tualatin.
And I'll just add to that, we're in the very early stages of scoping a potential transportation system plan update based on some of those comments that you made and the feedback that we heard.
Well, that will make, well, hopefully make some people happy. And then some things will be difficult. So, all right. So when you talk about need for affordable housing, one way to express that need is by looking at this concept of cost burden. This is for households in Tualatin. A household is said to be cost burden if the household is spending 30% or more of their gross income on housing costs. So housing costs are things like rent and basic utilities like heat, that kind of thing. Or if they're mortgage, then it's interest, those basic utilities, and insurance, housing insurance. So this is 2013 to 17 data. So it's a little bit older, but it's not like things have gotten all that much better in Tualatin, I don't think, more recently with more recent data. We took this out of the housing needs analysis. So when you look at it overall, about 37% of Tualatin's households spent 30% or more of their income on housing costs. 56% of renters did, and 26% of renters spent 50% or more of their income on housing costs. So people who are severely cost burdened, spending 50% or more of their income on housing costs, are in real trouble. Yes, please, Rachel.
I just wanted to point out that this is all data, not
Yeah.
just so that folks understand that it's probably worse right now for a number of reasons.
I fully agree that things have not gotten better, that they have likely gotten worse. But we're trying not to pool new data for things that this perfectly well expresses the issue. So, okay, so that's one version of housing need. So people who are paying too much for income. Another dimension of housing need is groups that have disproportionate levels of cost burden, meaning that they're cost burdened more frequently than the overall average. So for instance, people of color, so people, especially in Tualatin, people who are Latino, that's your largest group of color, but other people of color account for 25% of Tualatin's population. And they are cost burdened more frequently than the overall average. So they're have higher rates of cost burden. Their special need for housing, of course, is housing that's affordable, assistance to avoid displacement, access to housing in high opportunity areas, and access to housing without discrimination. And so access to housing in high opportunity areas, that's really about access to services, and those services could be medical services. They could be services like grocery stores. They could be specialized services that are unique needs of that household. So we're talking about, and also high opportunity areas are areas with access to jobs. So we're not talking about housing that's out on the fringe that is not connected well, either by pedestrian or bicycle or transit. So we're talking about areas that are more well connected. Seniors and people with disabilities, I've grouped them together because their housing needs are often pretty similar. So their housing is need for housing that's affordable, physically accessible, other types of accessible beyond physically. So oftentimes access to needed services. So those could be healthcare services, they could be other services. And then people experiencing homelessness. So their need is for housing that's affordable, but they've also got other needs like for immediate assistance or housing with services that helps them stay in their existing housing and improved access to an affordable unit. So I'm not going to go too deep into these groups. If you want to know more about this kind of housing need, the housing production strategy talks about it a lot and provides a lot of information about that. Before I go on, are there any questions? I promise you this whole project is not me talking at you. Okay. So then what's considered affordable? This data is from 2020, where the median household income for a family of 4 was $92,000. I think in 2021, it went up to $96,000, and I haven't looked at the 2022 data yet. And so this is a household of 4. So a household of 4 who earns median household income earns about $23,000 per month. Sorry, a household of 4 can afford about $2,300 a month in monthly rent without paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs. They can afford a house between $320,000 and $368,000. I don't have my notes right here with me about how much average sales prices are in Tualatin, but they're considerably above that. And so when you look at households, I'm going to look at households at the top end here at 120% or more of median family income. They can afford a house valued up to $440,000. Well, new single family housing and a lot of other new housing is being built that's affordable at or above 120% of median family income. That's not where the city is proposing to put its effort for affordability. So then shifting ourselves down to the other side here, households that earn 50% of median family income. Remember, this is a household of 4 still. Looking at $46,000 in income in 2020 and being able to afford about $1,100 in monthly rent. There isn't housing that's affordable at market rates. In other words, not privately owned, that's generally affordable at that income level. So households with income below about 60% of median family income, they can't afford without being cost burdened the market rate costs of rents. So if they are affording rents, then they're doing it by being cost burdened, which we saw a lot of renter households are. If you're talking about building newly built housing that's affordable to this group, you're talking about income restricted housing. You're talking about the kind of housing that I think Rachel is looking at building. The housing market, so private developers, they don't build that housing. And so that housing is supported by federal and state funds, but the city can also do things to support development of that kind of housing. That's a lot of what this project is about. And realize that a household of 1 is going to have lower income and still be at 50% of median family income than a household of say 6. It's going to have higher income than what we've got on here. So income varies based on household size. We're just showing a 4-person household. All right, so then housing that's affordable between 50% of median family income and 80% of median family income. So like 60 to 80 and up to 120% of median family income. A lot of the housing that's developed in that area, where it's newly developed and who it's affordable to, are households making more than 80% of median family income and sometimes above. So in other words, it's not financially feasible to build new multifamily housing that rents at less than $1,800 a month in rent. And that's, yeah, it's an approximation. I haven't done any pro forma work here. And this project is going to include a little bit of that, but not a lot. So that's housing that's above that is being built in Tualatin and the region. Housing that's below that, affordable below that, between that 50 and that 80, or that 60% and that 80% of median family income, that's the type of housing that's rarely built, newly built. And when it is, it usually has public subsidy in it. It usually doesn't have federal subsidy. It might be state and local subsidy. So that's what you might call your low income to your moderate income households, your sort of middle income households. This project is also about them. And what is it that the city can do or chooses to do to support development of that kind of housing? So when we look at how many households in Tualatin are in each of these groups, we're showing current households, and that's from the housing needs analysis. So it's a little bit old. And then new households, and that's new households for 2020 to 2040, based on the forecast and the housing needs analysis. And what we see is we've got quite a number of households in that below 50% of median family income. So that's about 3,500 existing or new households, and about 1,700 in that 50 to 80% of median family income, about 2,100 in the middle income, so 80 to 120%, and then more of them in the higher income. So what we're really talking about here, for the most part, is these groups, so below 80% of median family income. So it's the low income, a little bit over towards moderate income, these households. Are there questions about that? Okay, Robert, is this addressing some of your concern that we're not talking about higher income households?
Oh, yeah. I was just though thinking, that I didn't see very many homeless people in Tualatin, maybe Hillsborough, Beaverton and so forth, but not around here though. Seems strange.
I won't comment on that because I don't know much about that particular issue in Tualatin specifically.
They're there, but they're definitely very, very less visible in contrast to some other communities.
And if you think about people experiencing homelessness, realize that they're not in this data. The census does not collect good data about people experiencing homelessness. I'll get to you in a moment, Susan. But when you look at households that have income below 30% of median family income, of which Tualatin has quite a number, these are the people who are at risk of becoming homeless. Susan, you had a comment or a question?
Thank you. I just have, could you remind me, please, how old these numbers are as far as rent prices and homeowner, the value of homes or sale prices? They seem awfully low to me in today's market.
We will be updating information about rent and income, rent and sales price, rent especially. I'm not sure how much we're going to be getting into sales price. I don't think that we've got that data in here because it's not directly relevant to what we're talking about today. But we'll be talking about rents more, I think, in our next meeting. So Susan, we can bring you back a little bit more data about that. If it would be helpful, I mean, we could update this chart to the current median family income. I wouldn't want to update this chart, however, to it, because this is really set from the housing needs analysis. So.
Thank you. The previous chart that you showed, it quite honestly, it doesn't seem realistic to me in today's today. And even if you're not looking specifically at seniors or that generation, the other part of this is not only low income, but we don't have housing to support our workforce. And yes, that is definitely a complaint the chamber hears constantly, that they can't keep staff because they can't afford to live here. And even this chart that you're showing, what's considered affordable, that's not affordable. But I'm not sure you could find something to rent in this town anymore for $1,100.
Well,
would-
we will be talking some about, I will get you in just one moment. We'll be talking some about actual rents in an upcoming meeting. And I'll also assert that people in these groups, we will be talking about your workforce housing. Because people in these groups, they are working in your workforce. They're just not your entire workforce. Rachel, please go ahead.
No, I was gonna say the same thing. Those are bank tellers and baristas and childcare workers and some cases, social workers who are, so all of the folks in that chart there, you know, 50 to 80% of MFI, of median family income, they are most likely working, because if they weren't, then their income would be much lower than that.
Are there any other comments or questions? Okay. So I think I'm gonna hand it over to Corinne here in a few moments. We're gonna talk about the strategic actions under consideration in this project from the housing production strategy. I'm gonna take it on to a few of these slides and then I'll hand it over to Corinne. So one thing to keep in mind as we develop the housing production strategy and as we're thinking about implementing these actions is what does it take to develop housing? Well, development can occur when you've got land, when you've got public policy that supports that development, when you've got access to capital, and when it's marketly feasible, that's a new term, marketly, when you've got market feasibility. So Tualatin can obviously directly influence public policy in that the city, you know, sets the zoning and the density and the design requirements and those kind of thing. Tualatin influences the land, both through making sure that the land is zoned right and is within the city limits, that kind of thing. But also making sure that there's infrastructure or plans for infrastructure to serve that land. Because if you have vacant land with no water or no sewer or no transportation connections, then that land isn't very developable. Tualatin has limited influence on market feasibility. We'll talk about some of the ways that Tualatin can influence market feasibility today and in upcoming meetings through, say, tax exemptions, looking at ways to support in selected housing types, potential reduction to system development charges. Those all relate to market feasibility. The city, generally speaking, doesn't play a big role in access to capital, except if the city has rehabilitation programs. Some other cities do play a bigger role or a small, bigger role in access to capital. But that's not something that we really got into in Tualatin's housing production strategy. So remember that we're thinking about what is it the city can do. And through this project, we'll be looking at each of these items. So number one in the blue, affordable housing, that was the goal. That is the goal for the actions under that in the housing production strategy. And today we're looking at action 8.1, evaluate a low-income property tax exemption. It's affordable, the income levels that are served are those between no income and up to 60% of median family income. So it's that lower income groups. We've got other actions that we'll be considering under this. The items that are highlighted in green are, well, I've highlighted them in green on purpose because they're about money, they're about revenue. So today we'll be talking about implementing potentially a construction excise tax. And you can see that you know, helps income level served, mostly 0 to 60% and possibly 60 to 80%. So there are a few other actions that we'll be talking about in future meetings. So this is what we're talking about. Again, I'm just repeating the goals of this project and pausing to ask you all, now that you know more about what we're trying to do here, what would you like to see as outcomes from the project? And Rachel, if I can pick on you first, because you might have specific outcomes that you're hoping, or you think the city, I'm picking on you because you know more about affordable housing.
Well, thank you for that. I think I mean, it's very hard for me to separate my own organizational interest from what we're talking about broadly. Although to be a good committee member, I do need to do that. So I think broadly, I would like to see this project lay out some high priority opportunities to reduce impediments or barriers to affordable housing and create incentives that are within the city's control. And certainly resources. And I just want to say that from my perspective, resources is more than just money, because it can be things like you don't have to pay system development charges, which isn't like a cash transaction between this, the city and SEPA or another development organization, but essentially has that impact on a project. So I would love to see some of those kinds of things come out of this conversation. And then I think for me also it's a personal outcome is just getting to know folks in this room, because I feel like everyone in here is committed to affordable housing or they wouldn't be part of this conversation. So I think also maybe doing a little coalition building is also great.
Who would like to volunteer what outcomes they would like to see? Robert, you've talked about an outcome of making sure that people who are lower income are benefiting ultimately more from this.
And some of the things like on the last page that you just had up there, concern that I have, when we talk about taxes, or, being able to set aside, not have to pay taxes for these construction companies and so forth, is making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. I know in Lexington, Kentucky, they had you could be able to get a lower tax rate if you had so much property. Well, I can't think of it exactly how it went, but anyway, people were taking advantage of it. They weren't really qualifying for it because they would have these big mansions and 5 acres or more, but get this deductions off of their taxes though when they didn't really qualify for it, because things had changed at their household. And so that's something that more money could be going towards, for something else.
Those are good points. For some of one of the tax exemptions we're looking at, automatically the people who are benefiting, because the federal funds are going into this and state funds are going into that type of housing development. Essentially, the feds in the state, in their monitoring process, are making sure that people who are actually low income are benefiting. And Rachel could probably talk about way more about that than I could, if we need to at some point. For things like the multiple unit property tax exemption, the city has options about how it sets it up, and we'll talk about those options at a later point. But the city can have certain requirements, and then there's the question of how much monitoring of compliance with those requirements does the city do. So those are very well taken points. Do you have any other outcomes that you're looking for from this, Robert? Susan?
Not at this moment anyway.
Thank you.
I'm interested from several perspectives, but being able to give tax incentives and exemptions for developers and people that are walking in. It's just known developers, they want to make money. That's why they do it. So if we can encourage them with incentives and exemptions to build the type of housing that we need for our community and still make their profit, then I'm all for it. If they can come down, don't build the McMansions. We have plenty of those. But make it reasonable for them to want to come in and build. And as much as I advocate for seniors, workforce housing is extremely important in our community. And no matter what the salary that people make in the workforce, but our businesses who make up a majority of the tax base in this community are suffering because they can't get employees, because they can't come afford to live here. And when tolling goes in, we're really going to be up a creek if we can't get people to move here. So there are a lot of issues involved that branch out from this one particular topic.
Those are well taken points, and I want to assure you that none of what we're talking about here are McMansions.
Yeah, I know.
Everything that we're talking about here is 80% or below of median family income.
But you have to convince the developers that it's okay to build something that's not a McMansion, so that, and still make their profit, but to be more aware of what the true need in the community is.
And most of what we're talking about here is multifamily of some sort, and multi-story multifamily. So yeah, those will be issues that we bring up probably at the next meeting.
And encourage the city to raise their height limit.
That's a different housing production action,
Yes,
but
yes.
that is in there if I'm remembering correctly.
Oh, good. Okay.
So Zach, what outcomes are you looking for?
I've actually already heard several of the outcomes that I was hoping to see addressed mentioned in terms of the tax breaks, in terms of the populations that we're hoping to target, and in terms of the ways that we hope that oversight's going to move forward. One of the things that I would like to see is if we can work into this plans to make sure that these areas are accessible to people that are low income. I know you mentioned earlier the transportation plan that's being considered, but walkability, trying to make sure that it's hooked up to infrastructure in such a way that it's not car dependent, because that's often difficult to, especially today with parts and gasoline and other accoutrements being so expensive. Trying to reduce that sort of dependency, so that we don't make a home that is technically affordable based on somebody's income, but is practically inaccessible for their everyday use, is something I'd really like to talk more about.
And I think, Zach, some of that is probably going to be connected into the where of some of this that might happen. In other words, where within town might some of this kind of thing happen? And then with compliance with CFAC. When I say CFAC, that's the climate friendly equitable communities rules that aren't yet
Right.
finalized, but should be finalized soon. And that requires more, essentially it's going to result in more concentration of multifamily development, some of which will be affordable, hopefully. In areas that are more transit oriented or pedestrian and bicycle oriented, and have more limited parking. And so I think some of these things will dovetail together a little bit over time, more than a little bit.
Yeah, I think they definitely will. I'm looking forward to those conversations. Thank you.
Sure. Does anybody have anything else? Maybe Aaron or Steve has outcomes that they're looking for?
Something that might be helpful I'm thinking about is like multi-purpose, where you've got like the housing above and then retail below, which would also be able to help, where you work, where you live. And, less need for, transportation.
That's definitely something I think the city is planning for. That tends not to be an affordable housing type a lot of the time, because the ground floor has to be built to commercial standards, and that makes the building more expensive to develop. There's other tax incentives that support that kind of development, but because it wasn't affordable particularly, we didn't bring that into the housing production strategy. But there are certainly opportunities for that. Aaron, I saw that you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, and I think maybe to build off of what Robert was saying, I would be interested in seeing if there might be some incentives or ways we can encourage developers to maybe develop a share of affordable units within their market rate development. So I'd be interested in exploring if there might be tools in that toolbox.
So you're looking for mixed income development. So some development that's affordable, say below 60% of median family income, or between 60 and 80% of median family income, and development, in the same building, housing that's more expensive. So that essentially the more expensive housing kind of sort of vaguely subsidizes the less expensive housing. And there's some tools in here that can support that. It's a tough thing to do, but there's no reason we can't talk about it. Zach, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Something I think I forgot to mention, and perhaps this has already been touched upon. I think I mentioned them on my phone, so sometimes you guys are cutting in and out. My apologies. I know I heard somebody mention that we need to look at the height limit and a couple other issues about development that the city has in place. One of the things I'd like to bring up, and again, forgive me if this has already been mentioned, but I feel like this could dovetail very neatly with some of the initiatives that are contained in House Bill 2001 with the missing middle legislation and other forms of construction that are being encouraged to go in. There is that middle ground between a high rise that would require a height limit renegotiation and a McMansion with cottage clusters, with attached townhomes, with row houses, with lots of other forms of that middle style of affordable housing that is opened to us through House Bill 2001 now that those are permitted. And I think that there's a wealth of conversation to be had among some of those options that could be used to have development and more density and infill that doesn't necessarily alter the character of some of the areas that we're talking about in the downtown that are accessible to that infrastructure. So I'd love to talk more about how those things can work together.
So how does missing middle housing dovetail into this? Some of our colleagues have done a lot of work around missing middle housing, so we'll have the opportunity to pick their brains a little bit.
All right, I'm actively excited to hear that.
Okay, excellent. I just want to mention I'm looking at the housing production strategy here because, well, it's been a year since I really dug into this. Mixed use housing and redevelopment is one of the actions that's in there. It's largely regulatory. And so some of it hasn't made it into this work, this particular project, part of the project. And then there's the zoning and regulatory changes that again are some of what you've been talking about. So even if we don't get to talking about them here in the funding plan, they're in the HPS. So.
All right, thank you very much.
Sure. And, you know, to the extent that it's helpful to call out to them, then we can. So. All right. Any other comments?
Just one quickly, if I may. I just would like to echo Rachel's comment about coalition building, especially because in hearing all of your comments, I think that they're all very on point with the work that we're doing and very good observations about what the city could be doing. But I think that hearing from you all, that is to say that the council really needs to hear from you all to understand that these are community priorities and that these are things that we can put on our work plan like we have with this particular exercise. Also just note that we did have a grant application to do a zoning and regulatory code update that would have addressed some of these topics that you all have brought up. And so we did not receive that grant funding, and so we're looking at other strategies to move forward with some of it. And so I really appreciate hearing from you all and just understanding that that's something that we can continue to pursue with support from the community.
Thank you, Steve. So I'm gonna hand it over to Corinne to talk us through the first of our topics. You have a memorandum about this. I'm hoping that the memorandum is a little bit easier to understand once you've heard some of this. And the other thing is the longer memorandum that we gave you that has all of the strategies listed out. That's meant to be referenced as we're going through the project, so you don't have to refer back and dig things out of the HPS. So that's basically quoting information out of the HPS. Corinne, let me mute myself and let you talk.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Beth. And I think the input you all just gave is really interesting and is going to be really helpful. I'll just say I appreciate everyone's patience in advance because this is going to be a couple meetings somewhat of a slow march, but if you stick with this process next year, we're pretty optimistic that we can present some of these findings and could see some action. So, but to get there, we're gonna have to explain a lot of these different tools, and you all are gonna have to sort of give us feedback on. It sounds like everyone says, yes, we want more affordable housing. Yes, we want more tools. But this is going to be a little more nuanced because they are a little more complicated. There's a little bit of pros and cons that exist with some of these tools. So, try to take a look and see if there's any reason why the city shouldn't do it, or kind of how much bang for the buck there is for any of these tools. But we'll just get going on the construction excise tax, which we call CET. This is a new tax. Basically, it's a one-time new tax. When a developer goes to get their permit, this is it'd be an additional fee essentially on top of what they're already paying. So they pay that money to the city. The city can use it for different things. And I'll say it's slightly different for if you're developing a residential building versus a commercial or industrial. So as you can see on the slide, if you're building a residential building, you pay that money can be used then for incentives, and that is, affordable housing developer incentives. 35% of those funds, and we'll get into some charts that will help visualize this, can be used a little more flexibly for just affordable housing programs in general. 15% technically goes back to the state, but it's for home ownership programs. So it actually is helping, and I think it's bookmarked to the locality. So all of this money is getting funneled into affordable housing. It's just sort of split up into different pots. And as you can see at the bottom there, the commercial industrial CET, similar, 50% is dedicated to housing programs, 50 is a little more flexible. So next slide. What we ended up doing was looking back at some related projects and looking at what this could generate. So going back about 4 years, seeing how much income could be generated overall based on the kind of new development that was happening. So this is kind of a blanket. If all the development that happened in that 4-year period had this tax, what it would generate. Now, along the bottom there is the percent, because you can essentially go up to 2% on this tax. This is showing you how a larger tax percentage would get you more money.
Corinne, for commercial and industrial development, you can go above 2%. It's just that we didn't model that.
Sorry, you're right. The top end of that bracket is the peak of what we've seen over the last 4 years. So that's the maximum that we would expect you could see in a year if you were to have that rate. So about 2.5 million. Versus the bottom half of those brackets are the low end, saying, well, on a bad year, there's not a lot of development. It's actually not generating a lot of funds. Because, we'll talk about this again. This isn't a steady stream of funds. This is, you got a lot of development happening in a certain year, you're going to get more of these funds. If there's not a lot of development happening that year, you're going to get less. So it's a little bit inconsistent in terms of how much money you're getting year to year. But next slide.
Before I go on, what we're talking about is a percentage of, I think it's the building permit, the estimated building value. So if you had a 1% tax on that, it would be 1% of the value in the building permit that the developer would pay.
Yeah, sorry about that. And Susan, did you have a question, or you? No, okay. And I don't have too many slides on these, so we'll stop for questions, but feel free to interrupt me as well. So this is another way of looking at this. Again, along the bottom there is, if you were to have different percentage rates, one's larger, one's smaller, and how the money that be generated would be split in terms of the way the city could use that money. So the orange is unrestricted, the green there or teal would be dedicated to housing, and the dark blue, technically you can be using some for the admin costs on how you kind of process the programs.
And the city could choose to use the unrestricted funds for housing also. It seems a prudent thing to do, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So this is the same chart that we looked at, but this is just for residential as opposed to industrial. It's not quite the impact of the other one, and in terms of the commercial and industrial, still a nice funding stream, but just not as large. And some of that's reflection on the development that's been happening. It's probably a little more commercial and industrial than residential around town. And if you go to the next slide, this kind of gives you that split out of, here's how much money we're talking about that could be generated by CET.
And so, for instance, some cities have chosen, when they do the residential CET, to start with a smaller CET, like a 0.3%. I think that's where Ben started. Some cities have elected to go the full 1%. That is the most you could do in residential.
Mm-hmm.
Robert has a question.
OHCS? What is that?
Oregon Housing and Community Services.
Oh,
That's the amount that has to go back. That 15% that has to go back to the state for affordable homeownership programs.
Okay. But again, it should flip back to the local area for homeownership incentives. But yeah, we can go to the next slide, because I think this just wraps it up in terms of pros and cons of a CET. So again, a new tax. It is nice in the sense that it links industrial and commercial development to housing. A lot of times we disconnect those two things, but a lot of what drives housing growth are jobs, people getting jobs and living around that area. And sometimes it's nice to connect the folks that are making the jobs with the consequences of population growth and facilitating affordable housing. The second topic there is it's a little more flexible, and sometimes that can be easier for developers to have the city kind of work with them and figure out where that funding can fit into their pro forma, their sort of funding needs. And the nice thing, again, this is from the perspective, keep in mind, of city council and the sort of public who will have to decide on this. Part of the things they're going to be concerned about is, hey, where do we get the money to manage these new programs? So this is also highlighting that this funding source does have a bookmark to say, hey, some of these funds go to help operate it. So it's not going to take away from your existing operating budget to manage this program. Some of we'll say the cons, the trade-offs here, it does increase development costs, and that can impact feasibility. We think it's around the edges. It's a pretty small percentage depending on how large you go. But if the concern is supply, this can make it challenging for certain development. There is the possibility that this tax could be passed on to tenants. Obviously, with affordable housing, that's a little bit different, but I think for market rate development, this could easily be passed on to tenants in some form where their rent is, might see an increase. Not necessarily, but it could happen. And then, as I touched upon earlier, this is a one-time tax that happens when that construction permit is filed for. So depending on how busy your construction is that year, it's going to jump around a little bit. So that can make it a little bit challenging to plan for and to predict and to allocate. But I'll stop there. Any questions on the construction excise tax? And
I'll also mention that Tualatin, as we said, doesn't have a lot of vacant land, so you're not going to get a lot of greenfield development in areas that don't have existing development. So if the city grows faster than forecast, then more of your development would be through redevelopment. So I think one of the other cons is that you're not necessarily looking at a lot of expensive new housing being built, where having a construction excise tax of 0.5% or 1%, doesn't necessarily make or break the development. You just aren't going to see as much of that.
And I don't know if we noted this earlier, but there's no silver bullet for any of these funding sources. These are all going to be, probably layered to make a project work. So some of these don't work well together, but a lot of them do. This one I think would work well with different funding sources to again kind of make that affordable housing project happen.
The other thing I like about this one, especially for Tualatin, is since it can imply at some level to commercial and industrial, then you're also getting at least from new development some helping to fund housing for your workforce.
Mm-hmm. Again, the purpose of today is just to get some of these concepts, help you start to get aware of some of them. We're not really going to evaluate this and say yay or nay or any of that stuff today. We're going to be circling back to all these once we introduce them all and dig in a little bit more. This is just to start to get you all kind of aware and walk you through all the options that are on the table. Robert, you had a question in the chat, I think, about whether there is any additional land that could be pulled into Tualatin.
How about I talk about that?
Yeah.
So Tualatin is within Portland's metro urban growth boundary. The urban growth boundary is moved when metro deems and shows that there is need that can't be accommodated inside the urban growth boundary. The areas that are near Tualatin for potential expansion, they're called urban reserves. Those areas are in very contentious areas like the Stafford Triangle. And so I would imagine that an expansion for future development in areas for housing in areas that are near Tualatin is going to be more difficult than for other communities. Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
That sums it up nicely. Thank you.
All right. If there's no other questions, we'll move on. We're just going to go through one more of these, and then we'll break. This next one is it's a nonprofit tax exemption, and it's still a affordable housing program that's just a nonprofit developer. Tax exemption is essentially saying this new development does not have to pay their property taxes. So to Rachel's point earlier, sometimes it's hey, what can the city do to help fund my project? Sometimes it's what can the city do to eliminate costs to make my project more viable. So in this case, this is reducing the cost by reducing property taxes. It's considered a full property tax exemption. So that means it's not a percentage of your city taxes, it would be all of it and potentially all of the other taxing bodies too. And this is, I think, caps out at 60% AMI in terms of its eligibility for the tenants.
And AMI is the same thing as MFI. So we could
Sorry.
just
Yeah.
call that 60% of median family income. I think that there's a little bit of opportunity if you make a little bit more than that. It all depends on the eligibility for the nonprofit for their housing. But it's generally for 60% and lower. So affordable and deeply affordable housing.
So it's renewable. It lasts quite a bit, can be used for land being held for affordable housing as well. It's kind of interesting. It can apply, the city can do it unilaterally on the taxes they control. So that's about 16.5% of all your property taxes. But if you get over a majority of the taxes, the taxing body's control, then it automatically can get up to 100%. And we'll get into that next. I think we can keep moving. Yeah. So basically, this is a breakout of all the taxing bodies on property taxes and the share of the property taxes. So school district being the largest, the county, the city, and then all the kind of other entities. So basically, if the city decided to go with this and the school district went along with it, you could get 100% of the property taxes to be dedicated or to be allowed to be exempted. And we'll note that Tigard has this, and given the shared school district, that may, indicate that the school district would be open to contemplating this, but obviously we don't know. We can't really indicate that, but it has happened in a nearby area.
Rachel?
Well, the Tualatin School District does actually not tax affordable housing development. So we have not, so for all of our projects in Tualatin School District, they don't have that. And because it's such a large percentage of the taxing body, it impacts, we are forgiven our property taxes for the most part in all of our Tigard communities, also in Beaverton and in unincorporated Washington County. Not all school districts do that, but that one does. So I decided
that makes it easier to get on board with all the school district, all the taxing districts. So
I think
100%.
so. I mean, I think it makes a difference with the city of Tualatin, but yeah, it does. It does help that the school district is going to give us that designation. Now, it won't help us with Basalt Creek because the school is in Sherwood School District, just so you know.
That makes sense. So Rachel, can you tell us about why this tax exemption matters to an affordable housing developer?
Yeah, because yes, I can. So we don't charge very much for rent. So if we have to pay taxes, it adds a lot of money to our annual costs for a building. And that means that we have to increase the amount of debt that we have to borrow, or the amount of money we have to raise, to the extent that it will help us pay that off every year. So it's very expensive. And so having that, not having that cost means that every year we don't have to pay for it. And that actually really helps us a lot to keep rents down. So it's a really important tool.
Thank you.
Thanks. Let me keep moving. So this gives you kind of idea of what this could look like. So we took a look at a couple of developments nearby. Essentially, to Rachel's point, Tigard has been moving a little bit faster on some of these tools, and maybe coincidentally, there's been a little more development and more affordable housing development in that area. What we decided to do was to look at some of those developments, and also kind of just look at hypothetically what all would you be, how much would you be reducing the property taxes per unit? So that's what this chart is trying to show. The green is, hey, what if you couldn't get 100% of all the taxing bodies and you just got the city? The green and the orange is if you got it all, if you were able to get all of the property taxes abated or kind of removed, that's how much money you'd be saving the developer. So we can keep moving. We'll be kind of addressing some of these numbers. So then what that ends up about averaging out to is per unit around $1,000 per year. So on a 100 unit development, if you can get all the taxing districts on board, you're saving, you know, the firm like the one Rachel works for $110,000 per year, which is the way that you really do offset some of the money you're not getting in rent if you're an affordable housing developer and operator. Yep. And then just wrapping it up in some pros and cons. The nice thing is this can actually be used for existing affordable housing as well. So it can help keep affordable housing from switching to not being affordable housing because they can kind of opt in. It doesn't have to be triggered by new construction. It obviously, as we mentioned, reduces the costs, well, both the carrying costs, so the cost of holding land, and offsets the kind of year-to-year costs of operating that space. And really gives a lot of power to the city to keep it going as they see fit. And the city isn't losing money if affordable housing isn't built. So it's literally just, hey, if something gets built, you're not getting future money. You're not losing any of your existing tax revenue that's coming in already. You just aren't getting some additional funds you would be getting. So it's nice in that way to get the city to not actually feel like they're losing money. The challenges or the cons here is to make it really impactful. You do kind of need some other taxing districts to go along with this. As we mentioned, we think the school district has demonstrated that they're open to these concepts and getting on board. It theoretically reduces general fund revenues because that money is not coming in. You know, you could argue that money might not come in if you didn't incentivize it. There's some hypothetical games you can play there, but you can say that money is not going to be going in. So that is a con. And it doesn't quite help the development of mixed income housing or affordable housing built by for-profit developers. So again, the key to this one is this is a nonprofit developer. There are other tax exemptions that we'll talk about later that work for-profit developers. And that is it. We didn't want to kind of go overkill on some of the overviews here. Does that, any questions or thoughts?
I think you covered that pretty well. I don't have any immediate burning questions, although I'm sure I'll spend a lot of time looking over the memos and the write-up. Thank you.
Great.
So if we bring a similar level of information where we can about the other HPS actions that we're talking about, is this the level of information that is accessible to you and helpful for you? Because at some point we're going to have to say something along the lines of, okay, let's pile up all the things that cost money and let's pile up all the money together. And, you know, are we trying to spend more money than we have? What are we going to do about that? What do we think is most important? To a certain degree, we gave you two today that are certainly the nonprofit tax exemption is, in my opinion, a no-brainer. There's a lot of value in it. There's not a lot of big downsides to it. CET, you know, there can be more debate about that. And certainly if the city decides to implement it, it needs to do it working with developers to understand what it is that would make it less impactful for them. So that's less of a no-brainer, but I think also, given what you'll hear about funding sources, an important potential funding source. What we're trying to do is avoid overwhelming you with too much stuff all at once. So. Okay. Well, we don't have to take the full 2 hours if we don't need it. We can give you back a half hour of your life. Are there any other comments that you have? Any other questions?
One very basic one. I noted that this meeting, like many of the committee meetings is being recorded. Will the recording or a transcript be available for future review? And where will that be found?
That's a great question, Zach. The hope is that, yes, we will be able to post this to our city website. And once we have that location established, I'll share it with the group, just so you can refer back to this as a reference if you'd like.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And we'll be taking basic summary minutes, which isn't a he said, she said sort of thing. But it is a recording of potential concerns, ideas that are getting put on the table, any decisions that are made, that kind of thing. So that'll also be available. Any other questions? So our next step is to do a bunch more analysis and put some more memos together so that you guys have them for our next discussion. Set up with Aaron and Steve when that next discussion will be. As I said, I suspect it'll be a little more in October than sooner than that, because in all honesty, I'm taking a vacation. And this is, as I keep saying to everybody, it's all about me, really, you know. So that'll also give us a little more time to get a little bit more under our belt, because it sounds like we'll be able to bring more information to you to talk at a meeting about. So we don't want to underwhelm you either. So.
And I would just add quickly that if any of you have any questions about the material or just simply want to talk with us about it, Aaron and I can make ourselves available, you know, to have coffee and sit down with you and talk about something that you want to share with us, or just anything that you have questions about the material. You're not bound to, you know, limit it to the 4 times that we meet formally as this group. So I just want to share that.
Now, I know that 42 pages is a lot to take in and everything, so probably just for myself anyway, want to go through it and read it and, you know, try and absorb it. And then, you know, if there's any questions at that point.
Could I ask, I know it takes a lot to prepare for these kinds of meetings, and especially when we're not having one every week, but for our next meeting, can we get our packet of information ahead of time and not the day of? I was able to print it out and not really absorb what I was looking at. And I know there's a time crunch with everything, but if we could get it even a couple of days ahead of time before the next meeting's scheduled, I think we'd really appreciate that.
Thanks for that feedback, Susan. I'll be sure to get it out a little sooner next time. Thank you.
And we'll strive to get it to staff so that it can be gotten sooner. All right, well then I'm going to hand it back to Aaron and say if you have anything else. Otherwise, I think we're finished for the evening.
Yeah, I think you guys did a great job with this presentation and the closing comments. I don't really have anything to add, but
no, I think
like Steve said, if you have questions along the way, am I on mute or are you able to hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Just wanted to say, feel free to reach out to us at any time during this project if you want to talk or have questions. And with that, Steve, I don't know if you have anything you want to share, but I just want to thank you for your time and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
very much.
Good night.
Night.